Hello, and welcome back to Pathfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is part of a series I'm producing covering the various deities, factions, and NPCs in the Pathfinder role-playing game, and its setting, the world of Golarion. Today, I'll be picking up where I left off, a couple videos ago, with the faith of Chaldira, the benevolent goddess of the halflings. Like the halflings themselves, Chaldira's faith is known for its love of mischief, but in this interest, Chaldira is only one side of a coin. For all the ways Chaldira is benevolent, her rival, Thamir Gixx, is equally malevolent. As the halfling god of greed, opportunism, and thievery, Thamir turns his mischief into criminality, and his followers show a particular interest in violence and mayhem. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. With that out of the way, let's move on to the rundown. Thamir Gixx, often abbreviated simply as Thamir, is a secretive and malevolent deity of crime and mischief. He is considered one of the patron deities of the halflings, though his faith has also taken root among the other small ancestries of Avestan, and even a few humans. As a sort of shorthand, Thamir can easily be thought of as a halfling equivalent of Norgorber, as many parallels exist between their teachings. There are notable differences between them, however. Thamir encourages a degree of violence in all his followers, which leads to them being seen as more aggressive than most Norgorberites. At the same time, Thamir also prevents his faithful from harming the poor or the oppressed, and his teachings are specifically intended to appeal to halflings and others who find themselves beaten down by the cruelties of society. Thamir's faith mostly appeals to two groups: bitter members of the underclass and nocturnal criminals. That said, faith in Thamir tends to convert followers from the former group to the latter, with a degree of regularity. Thamir Gixx is commonly depicted as a halfling in a flowing dark cloak. Interestingly, as opposed to Norgorber, whose identifying features are completely invisible, Thamir appears instead as a nondescript halfling, who is basically the average male halfling in whatever region he happens to be in at the time. Despite his inconsistent physical features, he always gives off an air of menace or danger. His holy symbol and favored weapon, a dagger, is always visible on his person. One interesting aspect of Thamir's manifestation is actually his name. Thamir Gixx has not always been Thamir Gixx, and will not be Thamir Gixx forever. His last name changes over time, and always matches the surname or house of the ruling Primarch of Absalom. In this case, his name matches Gear of House Gixx, the currently missing Primarch who took power in 4660 AR. Prior to 4660, Thamir was known as Thamir Gixx, named for Gear's predecessor Seb of House Gixx. If the current acting Primarch, Winzel Starborn, should ever make his position permanent in Gear's absence, Thamir would become Thamir Starborn, and would take efforts both directly and through his church to edit all records of his name on Golarion to reflect his new identity. The reason for this evolving name is unclear. Interestingly, Paizo has begun referring to Thamir only by his first name as of the printing of Divine Mysteries. I suspect this isn't a retcon and is simply to avoid the name being outdated as soon as they decide to advance the narrative in Absalom. Thamir makes his home in Axis, which might seem odd at first glance, until you recall that Norgorber's own divine realm of Duskfathom exists as an underground city beneath Axis. Thamir's divine realm, called the Back Alleys, exists within Duskfathom, and consists of a series of twisting alleys and passages which double back upon one another in a constantly changing tangle. The whole realm is oppressively dark and quiet, making the whole maze even more difficult to navigate. Supposedly, only the blessing and allowance of Thamir himself can grant visitors and inhabitants of the back alleys the ability to locate Thamir's personal home at the center of the labyrinth. While those who dwell in the back alleys are overwhelmingly cultic followers of Thamir, no denizen of the realm is entirely safe from the Silent Blade. When dense fog and mist rolls through the realm, it is taken as a sign that Thamir himself thirsts for blood, and his violent tendencies are notoriously indiscriminate. Thamir's teachings to his followers emphasize opportunism and advancement above all other things, and he rarely encourages long-term thinking or strategizing on the part of his faithful. This leads to a degree of eagerness and aggression on the part of his followers, as they pursue their god's edicts. That's not to say, however, that Thamirans are categorically incapable of careful planning, however. A common saying among the faithful is, "I await the night," which refers less to waiting for the sun to go down and more to waiting for the right circumstances to arise before a task can be undertaken. Thamirans aren't stupid. They merely pursue opportunities more aggressively than most. And when they face the consequences of their actions, Thamirans readily seize the opportunity to further engage in mischief and criminality. As a deity of halflings, some followers believed that Thamir's teachings are leading to some larger plan, like liberation for all halflings, or even the supremacy of halflings on Golarion. Despite his popularity among halflings, however, Thamir doesn't act toward their collective advancement. His followers should advance themselves only, and broader societal goals are beyond the scope of his teachings. Unsurprisingly, as a god of mischief and criminality, Thamir Gixx is generally considered a dangerous deity, and his faith is outlawed in much of the world. From Shining Absalom and Opara to Agorion in the heart of Cheliax, followers of the Silent Blade must practice their faith in secret. For this reason, Thamir's holy text, the Secret Stories, is never written down, and is instead passed orally from disciple to disciple. The text consists of a series of parables, similar to the Peltry fables which I discussed in my video on Chaldera. Each parable follows a similar structure. A halfling, or group of halflings, is mistreated by someone. Then, either the victim or an avatar of Thamir himself enacts vengeance upon the perpetrator, generally leaving the victim with some improvement to their station. Each tale imparts a specific lesson to the faithful, from specific tactical advice like the importance of knowing when to recognize the opportune moment to act, to broader lessons about the importance of cleverness and the foolishness of mercy. The secret stories are expected to vary from region to region, with only the lessons and the broad story structures remaining consistent between tellings. Priests and followers are expected to edit the story to fit their current location, by changing the setting and characters to include local halfling families, nobles, and landmarks. As an editorial note, I really like the idea of the stories varying from city to city, but always being immediately recognizable to the faithful, since they understand the core story underneath all the embellishments and additions. Speaking of the faithful, followers of Thamir Gixx tend to be a secretive and solitary lot. Even formal priests rarely evangelize or actively lead worship services. Instead, followers tend to engage in more individualistic forms of worship. Devout followers of the Silent Blade often engage in thievery or assassination under the cover of darkness, seeing these acts as a form of worship. They typically partake in these activities in ways which specifically advance their own societal or financial standing, though few Thamirans are above engaging in occasional bursts of random violence for its own sake. Even so, vanishingly few followers of Thamir practice their faith in their public-facing persona. Most Thamirans lead a double life, at least to some extent. Many live as servants, entertainers, or common tradesmen, making a living off their day-to-day job just like anyone else. At night, however, things change. The followers pull up the hoods of their cloaks, buckle on their belt and brace of daggers, and venture into the darkness to live as their true selves. Many followers will stay out well past midnight into the sacred time of night which they refer to as the quiet hours. This period, from sometime after midnight to just before dawn, is as close to a holy time as the followers of Thamir observe, and they consider it the best time to engage in clandestine acts. When followers do collaborate, or discuss matters of the faith, this emphasis on secrecy continues. A common saying among the faithful is, "Hush now," and it is used by members of the faith to immediately end sensitive conversations when they might be overheard. Of course, the phrase is also uttered to the targets of assassination, so the last words the victims might hear are something akin to a Thamiran prayer. One odd trait, which might stand out to outside observers of Thamir's faith, is the god's edicts and teachings surrounding the poor. The poor and downtrodden generally have little to fear from followers of Thamir, at least compared to people of means. Thamir specifically forbids his followers from stealing from the poor, and some followers even interpret this as a discouragement from visiting violence upon them. Back in 1E, Thamir's deific obedience went even further. The faithful Thamiran was to place a coin in a street and wait for it to be picked up, then follow whoever took it for an hour. If that person was wealthy, the coin was to be stolen back. If that person was poor, however, the coin was to be left with them. This introduces some interesting nuance to Thamir's teachings. Followers are commanded to be self-interested, but are also forbidden from worsening the lives of the poor. They are specifically forbidden from begging for mercy, but are not forbidden from showing it, if they deem it appropriate. Unlike many evil deities, Thamir does allow for a degree of discretion on the part of his followers, which I really appreciate. It makes him feel more human, which, of course, makes him all the more dangerous. Unlike most other religions, priests of Thamir Gixx are not generally seen as helpful leaders. Thamiran priests are typically severe and stern, at least when they reveal their true personas to the world. They emphasize the importance of self-reliance and independence, rarely offering aid or assistance directly to their flocks. To the extent that they offer aid to their followers, it likely takes the form of tools or training to allow those followers to fix their problems on their own. Followers who actively seek help, and especially charity, from a Thamiran priest are likely to find themselves chastised or even punished for having violated Thamir's teachings about asking for help or mercy. Some priests do take on more conventional priestly duties, however, including evangelizing to oppressed halflings and leading worship services at hidden temples and shrines to the Silent Blade. Speaking of which, Thamiran temples are quite rare, though this shouldn't be surprising given the god's emphasis on secrecy and stealth. These locations, which are generally hidden in shadow and sparsely decorated, can often be found in close proximity to, or even hidden within, other temples or community spaces. The act of sneaking into these other temples likely serves as an act of worship in and of itself. Decor in these temples, to the extent which it exists, likely involves dagger imagery and dark cloth draperies. Far more often than in formal temples, however, followers of Thamir instead gather in secret hidden spaces, which have no formal connection to the faith. The act of gathering together seems to consecrate these spaces for worship, meaning alleys, basements, and abandoned buildings could all serve as houses of worship in times of need. By contrast to temples, formal shrines to the Silent Blade are fairly common, though they are difficult to spot for those not trained in the symbology of the faith. Shrines tend to take the form of simple, nondescript altars adorned with the image of a dagger, with no other significant decoration or visual flair. Like temples, these shrines tend to be hidden away in nondescript locations. Worship services to Thamir tend to take place during the quiet hours, that period between midnight and dawn which followers of Thamir consider sacred. On Golarion, the faith of Thamir Gixx can be found wherever large numbers of halflings congregate, and particularly where at least some of these halflings exist under some form of oppression or poverty. Just like my video on Chaldera, I pulled this map from the Halflings of Golarion book in 1E, as it highlights many of the major halfling population centers throughout the Inner Sea region. While any and all of these locations likely play host to the faith of Thamir, a few settlements are likely more heavily populated by Thamirans than others. Absalom, the city at the center of the world, is immense, and plays host to numerous criminal gangs and organizations, making it an ideal location for Thamir's faith to take root. The cities of Corentin and Egorion in Cheliax likely also play host to a large number of Thamirans, as the Chelish government is actively hostile to halflings, and until recently treated the entire ancestry as chattel slaves. To the north, Kaer Maga, the City of Secrets, is a location awash with mystery and conspiracy, factors which encourage Thamir's faithful to indulge in the activities of their faith. Similarly, Daggermark, in the River Kingdoms, plays host to an assassination guild, meaning Thamirans could find work with relative ease. Finally, Port Peril, the capital of the pirate nation of the Shackles, would present many opportunities for ambitious Thamirans to pursue their own advancement. History and Legends. The history of Thamir Gixx is invariably tied to the deity Norgorber, the god of thievery. Norgorber is a god of secrecy and crime, and has 4 aspects: Blackfingers, who deals with poisons and alchemy; the Reaper of Reputation, who deals with political secrets and blackmail; the Grey Master, who deals with thievery and profit; and Father Skinsaw, who deals with murder. He rose to godhood by passing the test of the Starstone, but vanishingly little is known about his past. What is known is that soon after his ascension, Norgorber's faith took root among the downtrodden halflings of the Inner Sea region. What's especially interesting for our topic, however, is that this ascension of Norgorber's faith coincides with the rise in popularity of Thamir's faith as well. Prior to this, records are murky about whether or not Thamir was recognized and worshipped as a deity. For this reason, religious scholars from all faiths have speculated and theorized about the relationship between Thamir and Norgorber. Some scholars believed that Thamir was a lesser deity who supported the mortal Norgorber as he attempted the test of the Starstone. These scholars generally believe that Thamir offered this support with the explicit goal of raising his own prominence in Norgorber's eventual shadow. This theory would generally consider Thamir to be an ancient deity, whose roots go as far back as the history of the halfling ancestry itself. Other scholars disagree, instead claiming that Thamir was a mortal friend and ally of Norgorber prior to his ascension. This theory goes that Thamir was likely a mortal halfling who performed some great service for Norgorber in life, and that Norgorber raised his ally to divinity as a reward after his own ascension. This would certainly explain the lack of knowledge surrounding Thamir's faith prior to Norgorber's eventual rise to power. This theory also tends to imply that Thamir Gixx is a servitor of Norgorber, or at least in some way subservient to the Prince of Thieves. Some go as far as to claim that Thamir is Norgorber's slave, though this appears to be a fringe position. Few legends exist about Thamir outside of these speculations surrounding his origins. His status as a god of secrets does not lend itself to highly publicized activities, meaning that no significant actions on the deific scale are reliably attributed to him. Members of the faith do pass stories among one another, though these generally function as parables or inspirational accounts of embellished historical events. These stories typically involve oppressed halflings turning to the teachings of Thamir, then putting those teachings to use. They use stealth, poison, and murder to then avenge themselves upon their oppressors. These stories nearly always end with the protagonist achieving their revenge, then acquiring some ill-gotten gains to further their own status in the world. Relationships. Unsurprisingly, Thamir is generally disliked by his fellow deities. Good and neutral deities find him far too self-serving and violent for their liking, though some certainly appreciate his unwillingness to steal from the poor. At the same time, many evil deities find him too chaotic to work with, at least for extended periods of time. This leaves Thamir with few close allies, though that doesn't seem to bother him very much. Like I mentioned already, Thamir's closest relationship is that which he maintains with Norgorber, the ascended god of criminality. To avoid spoilers, let me simply say that religious scholars suspect that Thamir may have been an ally before his ascension, though whether Thamir was a mortal or a deity at that time is hotly debated. Regardless of the relationship with the two deities, their faiths don't get along particularly well. Norgorberites tend to keep a distance between themselves and followers of Thamir. They find Thamirans to be too reliant on violence when addressing problems or challenges, though I'm not entirely certain if that distaste is true for followers of Father Skinsaw specifically. For their part, at least, Thamirans are far more willing to work with Norgorberites, and a few are even known to revere Norgorber himself in addition to their primary patron deity, especially when their work involves poisons. Like I mentioned last week, Thamir Gixx's greatest rival is Chaldira Zararistan, the benevolent halfling goddess of luck, mischief, and bravery. Despite their mirrored interest in mischief as a means of resistance against oppression, the two deities are so opposed in other regards that they cannot make common ground. Chaldira insists that Thamir's emphasis on violent mischief attracts too much attention to the oppressed, inviting even more tyranny. At the same time, Chaldira cites Thamir's emphasis on opportunism and selfishness as a counterpoint to his supposed interest in protecting downtrodden halflings. Interestingly, we don't know that much about Thamir's opinion on Chaldira. Most of the writing on this topic addresses her opinions rather than his. That said, Thamir's faithful absolutely despise Chaldirans, taking great pleasure in torturing and killing them. If anything, however, this aggression might very well galvanize the Church of Chaldira to treat followers of Thamir with even more animosity, driving them to seek his faithful out and exterminate them with even greater zeal. Recent Revelations. Warning: the following section contains major spoilers for the Curtain Call adventure path, and I highly suggest watching my video on it to determine if it might appeal to you before watching this section. I'd hate for someone to spoil any of Curtain Call's many secrets and surprises. If you want to remain spoiler-free, skip ahead to the next section. Alright, spoilers ahead. The Curtain Call AP provides significant updates on the story of Norgorber and Thamir Gixx, revealing the specifics of their origins in remarkable detail. This information is presented in a post-campaign article called The History of Secrets, which is itself based on an in-universe long-lost opera, also called A History of Secrets. This opera was supposedly written by some unknown denizen of Hell, though the opera features the deities Girona, Mahathala, and Geryon as narrators and commentators. Long ago, in the city of Vyre, the fates of two ruling families became intertwined. Jax Dunrock is born to House Dunrock after the family moves to Castle Dunrock in the city's harbor. Cleome Gorb, meanwhile, is born 3 years later to the powerful and wealthy House Gorb. Unfortunately, the situation in Vyre at this time was far from stable, as the recently arrived House Zakar, led by the murderous Inaverin, was constantly acquiring more power and wealth for itself. Inaverin moonlighted as the infamous Sundown Skinner, a terrifying serial killer, and his violent tendencies served his house well. Of course, Inaverin's status as the head of a powerful house drew attention and hatred, and soon the assassin Thamir Redhand from Absalom attempted to take his life. This attempt ended in failure, but House Gorb took the assassin in and offered him a job as bodyguard for the house's many young scions, including Cleome. Years later, Jax Dunrock joined House Gorb as a bodyguard and a thief for hire. He and Thamir became fast friends, and Jax soon became smitten with Cleome, who reciprocated his feelings. Jax and Cleome proved quite the power couple, with Jax becoming a feared thief under the identity Greymist, and Cleome founding the infamous spy network known as the Reaping Spiders. Their combined efforts proved effective at undermining the efforts of Inaverin Zakar, putting a stop to House Zakar's rise. At the same time, Cleome gave birth to Jax's son, whom they named Jaxter. As Jaxter grew, he apprenticed under Thamir, whom he affectionately called Uncle Thamir. Thamir taught the boy the art of alchemy, and the youth proved an effective student, earning the nickname Blackfingers for the way his constant experimenting stained his hands. But all was not well within Vyre. Inaverin Zakar became obsessed with Cleome, and loudly and publicly proposed to join their houses with a political marriage. This all might have amounted to nothing were it not for Jaxter. At the age of 11, Jaxter, upset by Inaverin's advances on his mother, snuck into House Zakar in an attempt to learn their secrets. He was captured, however, and Inaverin threatened to kill him in retribution. Cleome manipulated local politics in an attempt to save her son, and Inaverin, who truly only ever wanted Cleome for himself, relented. He took Jaxter's left eye as punishment, but ultimately let the boy go. Cleome and Inaverin were married soon after, and within a few years, Cleo gave birth to Inaverin's daughter. Naturally, Jax was horrified by this turn of events, and was constantly on the lookout for Inaverin's more violent tendencies. It didn't take Inaverin long to threaten Cleome and her daughter, and Jax responded by planning an assassination mission to save their lives. Jaxter, concerned that his father's actions might lead to a civil war among the ruling families which would see everyone killed on both sides, took matters into his own hands. Putting Thamir's teachings to use, the young man poisoned Inaverin, allowing his mother and half-sister to flee back to the safety of House Gorb, though the sister would only remain there for a time before being sent away for her own protection. Inaverin's death needed to be punished, however, and Jax offered up a false confession to spare his son's life. As he lingered in prison and awaited execution, Jax was visited by Cleome and Thamir. Jax and Cleome were married in a secret ceremony by a priestess of Sivana, which legitimized Jaxter as Jaxter Gorb. Thamir, meanwhile, offered his old friend a poison to dull the pain of execution, and Jax died soon after. Jaxter, appalled by the political landscape in Vyre which had led to so much misery for his family, began to agitate for revolution, and in 1882 AR, the Revolution of Indulgences consumed Vyre. Despite Jaxter's best efforts, the revolutionaries executed his mother Cleome. Jaxter then collected Thamir, and the pair of them left Vyre forever, determined to seek Jaxter's half-sister. Many years later, Jaxter attempted the Test of the Starstone, and ascended to divinity as Norgorber, using the many criminal personas he had crafted over the years to represent the four aspects of his interests. These aspects were based on his mentors: the Grey Master from Jax, the Reaper of Reputation from Cleome, Father Skinsaw from Inaverin, and Blackfingers from Thamir. After his ascension, Norgorber sought out his only living former mentor, Thamir Redhand, who was dying of disease. In an attempt to save his former pupil from the pain of putting him down, Thamir took his own life, taking with him the last connection Norgorber had to his mortal life. Unwilling to lose this last connection, however, the one who was formerly Jaxter grabbed hold of Thamir's soul and pulled it from the River of Souls, accidentally raising him to lesser divinity. If you'll allow me a chance to editorialize for a moment, I really like the classical tragedy feel of this story. It's presented as an in-universe opera, and it feels very operatic in scale and structure. The story gleans a lot of drama from a small cast of characters, and I appreciate that basically every character meets a tragic end in a way which feels reminiscent of ancient Greek or even Shakespearean theater. For players who might be interested in playing characters who follow Thamir Gixx, here are a few useful details. For those using the alignment rules, Thamir is chaotic evil, and will accept clerics of only that alignment, and neutral evil alignment. His edicts are to seize any opportunity that would benefit you, to solve your problems with violence, and to hide your true intentions. Conversely, to steal from the poor, or to beg for help or mercy from a fellow worshipper of Thamir, are both anathema to Thamir. His holy symbol is a black dagger with a hole or white circle at the base of the blade. His divine font is Harm, and clerics and champions of Thamir can choose unholy sanctification, though they are not required to do so. Thamir Gixx's domains are ambition, confidence, trickery, and wealth. Thamir's sacred colors are black and brown, but followers of the Silent Blade rarely display their faith through clothing or other decorations. Instead, followers almost universally hide their faith, especially during the daylight hours as they work their day jobs. Followers of Thamir can fill any number of roles in their secular employment, and no specific job or field of employment appeals to them. At night, however, the followers of Thamir expose a truer version of themselves. They don dark clothes with hoods, masks, and cloaks, then embrace the shadows of the night and go about their nocturnal mischief and mayhem. Rather than wear holy symbols of Thamir, however, most followers simply use their knives and daggers as de facto holy symbols, to offer prayers and conduct rites. Speaking of knives and daggers, the dagger is the favored weapon of Thamir Gixx, and is extremely common among his followers. For followers seeking to branch out, any weapon in the knife group could be an excellent choice, from the star knife to the war razor. Weapons with the concealable trait are likely more common among the faithful, to aid in their ability to avoid detection while they engage in clandestine acts. The trip, backstabber, and disarm traits might also be common, representing other mischievous acts which Thamir's followers might take in combat. I've found no evidence of special training or combat styles practiced among the faithful, though they likely specialize in one-handed bladed weapons over any other type. Thamir's favored animal is the raccoon, a critter known for causing mischief and stealing objects which it perceives as valuable. In addition to these animals, followers of Thamir might gravitate towards small creatures, which can go unnoticed, or nocturnal creatures, which serve their masters effectively during their nightly endeavors. The Church of Thamir is relatively small, and I could reasonably see both war priest and cloistered clerics serving effectively, though I doubt that battle harbingers would be especially common. Rogues are, by a pretty wide margin, the class best suited for followers of Thamir, and any rogue racket is a good choice. Similarly, the Investigator is another class which is likely heavily represented among the faith, especially one which focuses on alchemy. Speaking of, alchemists are likely represented among the faithful as well, particularly if they focus on poisons. I could see a rascal or gymnast swashbuckler fitting in nicely, and any ranger build, including the Vindicator, could also be a great option. I imagine that champions of Thamir are fairly rare, but those which do exist are likely devoted to the cause of iniquity. The acrobat, assassin, or shadow dancer archetypes are likely common among followers of Thamir. As for spellcasters, the Shadowcaster might be a great way to represent Thamir's emphasis on stealth and secrecy. Hag or Shadow Bloodline sorcerers would fit this theme as well, as might Starless Shadow Witches or bards with the Enigma, Polymath, or Battle Muses. As might be expected for a halfling deity, Thamir's followers are most commonly halflings, and his faith is most prominent in the halflings of the Inner Sea region, and especially southern Avestan. I haven't found any evidence of Thamir's faith extending into other regions, but I wouldn't be surprised if it existed in small pockets all around the world. More so than Chaldira's faith, which I discussed a few videos ago, Thamir's faith also appeals to a fair number of non-halflings. These followers are typically drawn in by the evangelism of a devout halfling, and often come from regions where the lower classes are oppressed. While the faith might appeal to any and all who might consider themselves downtrodden, it most commonly takes root in the hearts of small folk, mostly gnomes and ratfolk, but also goblins. Followers of Thamir tend to be secretive, ambitious, and pragmatic. They hide their true intentions behind masks both metaphorical and literal. They patiently await the opportunity to capitalize on the mistakes or weaknesses of others, then mercilessly strike to advance their own goals. Even so, they have a tendency toward aggression, and generally care less about the consequences of their actions than most cultists of similar deities like Norgorber. This combination of secrecy and aggression makes them especially dangerous and difficult to predict. For GMs looking to integrate Thamir Gixx and his followers into a campaign, here are some ideas. Like many lesser deities, Thamir does not have a listed herald or listed divine servitors. He likely has servants, as vanishingly few deities operate entirely alone. These servants simply haven't been classified in detail by Paizo. Most of his servants likely take the form of former worshippers whose souls have coalesced into the back alleys. They might manifest as halflings or other small folk draped in shadow. Some servants might also manifest as raccoons or poisonous animals like spiders. Interestingly, some followers believed that Thamir acts as a servitor of Norgorber, though this appears to be speculation rather than fact. Thamir shows his favor to devout followers by obscuring their presence, with magically muffled footsteps, or with intensified shadows in which they can hide. Those who earn his ire, meanwhile, might find themselves tripping or slipping at inopportune moments, ruining any chance they had at stealth or secrecy. Thinking about campaigns involving Thamir, the most obvious use for them is as criminal kingpins. Thamirans are ambitious, ruthless, and talented, making them well-suited to the narrative role of a powerful network of antagonistic thieves for heroes to oppose. GMs might draw inspiration from the various thief and assassin guilds throughout the Elder Scrolls games to help flesh out a criminal gang with colorful characters and plotlines, which heroes can oppose and unravel over the course of a multi-level city-based campaign or adventure. For a taste of this type of story, you might consider reading through the Council of Thieves AP from 1st edition. Reframing the narrative a bit, it could be fun for a group of players to put together a team of thieves and miscreants to tell a heist narrative, following in the footsteps of Ocean's 11, The Italian Job, or Heat. Part of the fun of these stories is assembling the team of diverse characters with a variety of skill sets, and followers of Thamir could easily fit into this dynamic. In a heist, a follower of Thamir could easily take on the role of the character actor, the hot-headed muscle, or the master lockpick or pickpocket. Other deities which characters in a story like this might worship include Norgorber, Sivana, and Calistria, among many others. Finally, I like the idea of playing on Thamir's teachings surrounding overthrowing oppression and supporting the poor to put his followers in an uncertain alliance with more conventionally good deities. This could be most obvious in Cheliax, where Thamir and his followers actively seek to undermine the diabolic regime of House Thrune. Their opposition to the Thrunes could make them especially useful to organizations like the Firebrands or the Bellflower Network, who might otherwise be opposed to working with murderers and assassins. The churches of Caden Kalian, Milani, and Chaldira would likely find themselves in a similar position, and could struggle with the idea of using an evil ally to further their benevolent goals. I like the idea of using a Thamiran crime lord in Cheliax as a despised but necessary ally in a rebellion against the Thrunes. This would force the protagonists to constantly watch their backs for this ally's eventual exploitation of their goals, contributing to a sense of narrative tension in a campaign with an otherwise black and white moral outlook. Sources and additional reading. For those of you who are looking for some additional reading on the subject of Thamir Gixx, the following were my sources for this video. The primary sources for this video were Reaper's Right Hand, the third book in War for the Crown, and Bring the House Down, the third book in Curtain Call. Reaper's Right Hand provides a detailed article on Thamir's faith and the practices of his worshippers. The adventure itself also contains a few characters involved in Thamir's faith, who give some valuable in-universe insight into their religion. Bring the House Down, meanwhile, provides a detailed look at the history of Thamir and Norgorber, which I won't go into here to avoid spoilers. Lost Omens, Gods and Magic, Inner Sea Gods, and Divine Mysteries also each provide some information on Thamir, though not nearly as much as my primary sources. Finally, Halflings of Golarion is a broadly useful source on halfling culture, including the worship of Thamir, though I would only consider that a secondary source, as it is pretty old and has been contradicted in some places by more recent Paizo publications. So, that's it. That's Thamir Gixx, the Silent Blade, halfling god of mischief and crime. He provides an excellent counterpoint to the more benevolent Chaldira whom I discussed previously. I appreciate that he is so similar to Norgorber, but has enough narrative differences to both remain interesting for players and provide a source of interreligious conflict for GMs. I have no idea what video I'm making next for this channel, so stick around, and I guess we'll find out together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.